Ever build something with your bare hands just to remind yourself you're still standing? That bridge wasn't just lumber and screws, it was my sanity, stained honey gold and curved just enough to convince me the world still had room for quiet beauty. Then Brenda Coldwell came along, all clipboard and veneers, and turned it into splinters without so much as a knock on the door. You don't know rage until you've seen 3 months of meditative carpentry bobbing in a lake while a woman in designer heels waves at you like she's hosting a garden party. In most neighborhoods, backyard disputes end with awkward apologies and passive-aggressive muffins. But in Birch Hollow, we don't do muffins. We do warfare. Legal, emotional, and apparently aquatic. I'm talking sabotage signs, HOA fines that smell like pyramid schemes, and a secret buried so deep it makes swamp water look refreshing. So let me ask you this. If someone turned your peaceful little backyard bridge into modern art using a bulldozer and a clipboard, what would you do? Comment below. Bonus points if your revenge plan involves power tools, sarcasm, and at least one mildly illegal use of a kayak. I moved to Birch Hollow Lakes after the divorce. Just me, a garage full of tools, and the quiet dream of living beside water that didn't talk back. I wasn't chasing luxury, just some peace, maybe a duck sighting or two. Paid $475.00 K for a decent 3-bed with a sloped yard that kissed the lake's edge. As a former civil engineer, I figured a modest wooden bridge from my lawn to the little floating dock would be the perfect weekend project, therapeutic even. No contractors, no shortcuts, just me, some pressure-treated pine, and the ghost of Bob Vila cheering me on. For 3 months, I spent my Saturdays sanding, carving, and fastening every inch of that bridge. It curved just right, hovered 4 feet above the water, and ended with a bench facing sunrise. That bridge was my church pew. Then came the envelope. Tucked under my windshield wiper like a parking ticket from God, the header read Birch Hollow Lakes Homeowners Association, already a red flag, and the signature at the bottom curled like a villain's mustache, Brenda Caldwell, HOA President. According to Brenda, my bridge was an unauthorized structure that violated shoreline uniformity standards and had to be removed within 10 business days. Apparently, my handcrafted masterpiece was obstructing the aesthetic cohesion of the lakefront experience. That's HOA speak for you made something without asking Brenda first. So I did the polite thing. I called her, scheduled a visit, and brought over blueprints to show her the bridge wasn't just safe, it was borderline art. Brenda's mansion looked like it had its own Yelp page, circular driveway, stone lions, and enough landscaping to require its own zip code. She answered the door in a silk blouse that probably cost more than my table saw, smiled with her mouth but not her eyes, and offered me espresso from a machine that whirred like a Tesla in labor. I laid out my case, explained the design, the environmental compliance, even offered to stain it a color that matched the HOA's sacred hoe. Brenda listened politely, then snapped like a twig dipped in honey. "This isn't a negotiation, Mr. Saunders," she said. "Birch Hollow has standards. You want to build quirky little wooden things? Try Etsy. This is a curated community, not your weekend therapy session." And just like that, the meeting was over. 2 weeks later, I came home from the hardware store to find the bridge gone. Not taken apart, not gently relocated, obliterated. A demolition crew was wrapping up while Brenda stood on her marble-tiled balcony, arms crossed like a Bond villain surveying a job well done. The splinters of my bridge floated like driftwood, survivors of a shipwreck. She didn't even blink when I walked up. Just gave a dainty little wave like we were neighbors sharing lemonade instead of trauma. That night, I walked waist-deep into the lake and gathered every piece of wood I could find. I built a new sign from the scraps and planted it in the same spot the bridge used to begin. It read, "This was mine." Because it wasn't just a bridge. It was proof that I could still build something beautiful after life bulldozed me. And Brenda? She didn't just destroy a project. She bulldozed what little piece I had left, but I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Up to the bridge, I figured I'd reached the peak of Brenda's madness. Turns out I was just boarding the roller coaster. The week after my floating heartbreak, I met Frank Delaney while refastening a plank on my dock. He showed up holding a screwdriver and a six-pack, the kind of neighborly gesture that usually means, "I heard you ticked off the clipboard queen." He said Brenda fined him $300, 0 cents last year for having burgundy curtains. "Not HOA approved," he muttered, like he was admitting to a felony. Apparently, the HOA had issued a silent decree on acceptable curtain colors, eggshell, linen, or whatever matches Brenda's soul. Frank leaned in and whispered, "She threatened to lien my house if I didn't switch to beige." That's when I realized my bridge wasn't the first casualty in this suburban dictatorship, and it sure wasn't going to be the last. A few days later, I got an unexpected visit from Donna Reeves. Sweet lady, retired teacher, owned the place 2 doors down with flower beds so bright they made your eyes squint. She stood on my porch holding a cookie tin and a nervous smile. But inside the tin, not cookies. It was filled with copies of HOA fines going back 2 years. Fines for planting daffodils instead of tulips. Fines for placing wind chimes that interrupted the community soundscape. Fines for bird feeders allegedly encouraging territorial behavior. Donna called it her receipt box, and every slip of paper had Brenda's name printed across the bottom like a stamp of oppression. "I was scared to say anything," she said, "but after what she did to your bridge, maybe you're the spark we needed." Funny thing about sparks, they look harmless until they hit dry brush. And Burge Hollow, it was all kindling. That same day, I found a new notice folded neatly on my doormat. Another fine, this time $3,000, 0 cents. The offense? Environmental contamination due to unauthorized lake debris. Translation, the splinters from my demolished bridge, which I hadn't even removed because, well, I wasn't the one who hired a wrecking crew. Brenda claimed the wood was polluting the lake's aesthetic, not the water quality, just the look. Her letters read like ransom notes with Helvetica font. They always began with "Dear Resident," as if she couldn't bring herself to type our names, and ended with threats disguised as community care. The tone was pure corporate hostage negotiator. We encourage compliance to maintain harmony. Harmony, in Brenda's world, meant silence, submission, and matching garden gnomes. So I decided to play along, just not on her terms. I added a second sign next to the first. This one said, "Still mine." I nailed it right where the bridge once began, bold white letters on cedar planks, so every time Brenda sipped her wine on that oversized balcony, she'd see it and remember that control only works on people who forget what they're worth. That sign became a conversation starter. Neighbors began stopping by, sharing quiet war stories, looking over their shoulders like they were talking about a cult. One guy, Artie something, told me he got a $150 0-cent warning for leaving his recycling bin out too long after pickup. Another woman said Brenda once cited her lawn flamingos for avian clutter. You could almost hear the HOA's nonsense morphing from absurdity to collective outrage. And once neighbors start talking, dictators start sweating. Now, I'm no lawyer, but I've been around enough city ordinances to know when someone's bluffing behind big words. I started digging county regulations, environmental codes, property rights statutes. Turns out, Brenda's claim of lake contamination didn't hold legal water. She was using language from a municipal clause that applied to commercial dumping, not sawdust and bridge remnants. The deeper I dug, the more I saw the pattern. Intimidation dressed up in fine print. I wasn't just fighting over wood anymore. I was brushing the dirt off something bigger, something older. And if this whole HOA power game had a skeleton closet, I was just beginning to pick the lock. Because what if the bridge wasn't the story? What if it was just the first splinter in a dam full of secrets? I always thought the lake was just a lake. Man-made, sure, but scenic enough to make you forget it. Turns out, it was more like a polished mirror hiding a broken floorboard. After Brenda's third fine in as many weeks, I figured it was time to stop reacting and start investigating. I headed down to the county planning office, the kind of place where the coffee's bitter and the secrets are filed under dust. I asked about the lake's infrastructure. and got a polite shrug followed by a faded blueprint from the 1966. The dam? Built in 1964 by Caldwell Construction. That name sounded familiar because, of course, it was Brenda's family company. I stared at the document like it had just confessed under oath. The last formal inspection listed was dated 1988, stamped by an engineering firm that no longer exists. I asked the clerk if there were any recent records. Maintenance logs, water tests, structural reports. She blinked, tapped a few keys, then leaned back and said, "Nope. Nothing newer than shoulder pads and cassette tapes. That's not just a paperwork gap. That's generational neglect. The more I read, the more the lake stopped feeling like a backyard feature and started looking like a liability with a reflection." I walked out of that office feeling like I'd just been handed a loaded question. If the lake was this old and this poorly documented, what else was rotting beneath the surface? When I got home, Donna was waiting on my porch. She held an envelope like it was radioactive. "I think you should see this," she said. Inside was a letter, yellowed and delicate, written by her late husband in 1994 to the county health department. It warned of persistent discoloration during low water periods and unusual odors consistent with algal overgrowth or industrial runoff. He'd requested testing and regular monitoring, but there was no record of a reply. Donna looked at me like she was confessing to a crime. "He tried to push the board back then, but they said he was stirring up panic. He stopped after they threatened legal action." That's when I knew this wasn't just HOA drama. This was legacy-level damage control, passed down like a cursed heirloom. So I did what any former engineer with a grudge and a printer would do. I built another sign. This one read, "Truth over rules," in bold block letters, and right below it I stapled a laminated QR code that linked to everything I'd found: blueprints, inspection gaps, Donna's letter. I planted it in the same spot the bridge once stood, tall enough that Brenda could see it from her balcony without binoculars. Within 24 hours, 3 neighbors had scanned it and asked me if the lake was safe. I didn't have an answer, but the real question was finally starting to float. What else had Brenda been painting over with tulips and curtain memos? Brenda didn't waste time firing back, but this time the fine came in a plain envelope, signed from her personal email. Not the official HOA letterhead. The charge? $2,500, 0 cents for unauthorized signage promoting fear and misinformation. I almost laughed. Her signature trembled like her grip on this kingdom. The paper didn't carry the usual legal language either. It was laced with passive-aggressive tone and thinly veiled desperation. That's when it hit me. Brenda wasn't just irritated, she was rattled. Because once people stop fearing the fine, they start asking where all the money and silence went. And let me tell you, if there's one thing scarier than a bad dam, it's a good question. I stared out at the lake that night, watching the moonlight ripple across the water like it didn't know what was underneath. I used to think Birch Hollow was just strict. Now I was starting to think it was buried, layered in secrets and shiny distractions. And if the foundation was as cracked as that dam, someone had to open the floodgates. The only problem was I hadn't yet figured out what would come rushing out. But I had a feeling Brenda already knew, because people who've spent their lives covering something up, they're not afraid of noise, they're afraid of exposure. By the time the 4th fine arrived, this one accusing me of environmental fear-mongering, I realized polite resistance wasn't going to cut it. If you want to shake loose the truth in a place like Birch Hollow, you've got to rattle the furniture. And nothing rattles a community built on property value fairy tales like exposing what's hiding beneath their glittery lake. That's when Frank Delaney and I decided to, let's call it, nudge nature along. See, every man-made lake has a spillway gate, usually rusted, rarely used, and conveniently ignored by people who think natural beauty means someone else cleans it. All we had to do was loosen the right bolts at the right time and hope the truth floated to the surface instead of sinking deeper. It wasn't sabotage, it was science, with just a pinch of mischief. We picked a Wednesday evening, just after sunset, when visibility's low but paranoia's high. Frank staged a dramatic boat emergency across the lake. Engine noise, smoke, a few convincing cries for help, while I slipped behind the maintenance shed like a dad at a family reunion. The spillway was locked, but I'd been cutting padlocks since high school shop class. Inside, the mechanism looked like a leftover from a Cold War submarine. Cranked slow, creaked loud, and let out a groan so deep I thought it might wake the HOA founding fathers. I opened it just enough, half a turn, no more. The goal wasn't to flood the town, just to peel back the lake's makeup and see what kind of bruises it was covering. By Thursday morning, the lake had dropped maybe 6 inches. Barely noticeable unless you were paying attention. But I was paying attention, and so was my nose. The shoreline, once picture-perfect, now had little puddles of black sludge that smelled like old batteries and wet paint. The water didn't ripple, it oozed. That afternoon, Brenda sent out a neighborhood-wide email titled Temporary Natural Fluctuation. According to her, the lake's changes were a seasonal response to minor climate shifts, which, translated from HOA speak, meant don't ask questions, just repaint your shutters. But folks had eyeballs, and some of them had cameras. By nightfall, I had a dozen photos sent to me privately. Some showed dead minnows, others showed thick bubbles forming along the shore, like the lake was trying to burp up a secret. That's when Jasmine Patel knocked on my door. I knew her in passing. Smart, quiet, single mom who kept her yard so tidy it looked like a magazine ad. But she had that look, like she'd stopped being quiet. "My son came home yesterday complaining the lake smelled like nail polish remover," she said. "I thought he was exaggerating. Then I walked down there this morning." She pulled out her phone and showed me a video. Fish struggling near the surface, the water clouded and swirling. "This isn't seasonal. It's toxic," she said flatly. And I called the state environmental hotline. Just like that, we had a new ally. And now the game wasn't just local. We just invited the referees. By Friday, word had spread faster than Brenda's finds. Neighbors started walking slower by the lake, pointing at patches of greasy sediment, whispering in 2s and 3s like kids discovering their teacher lied. The HOA's shiny silence was cracking, and Brenda was scrambling. She sent a follow-up email reminding residents not to jump to conclusions based on incomplete observations. That's a fun way to say, stop noticing things I can't explain, but the damage was done. Truth has a smell, and once you catch it in the wind, you can't pretend it's just the roses. And me? I stood at the edge of that oily shoreline thinking, the lake dropped like a politician's poll numbers. Steady, undeniable, and just low enough to make the whole illusion start to tremble. It wasn't sabotage. It was transparency with a wrench, and the lake was starting to speak. Quietly, but with authority. I knew we'd only just started to uncover what was really down there. But if that water level kept dropping, we weren't just going to find pollution. We were going to find proof. And if Brenda thought a few angry emails could stop that, she was in for a bigger surprise than a fish die-off in a retirement community. If this story hit close to home, or if you know someone who's ever tangled with an HOA clipboard warrior, go ahead and share this video with them. Maybe they've got a Brenda of their own. And if you found something useful, something true, something that made you laugh or nod your head, send it to a friend. Because the only thing stronger than one voice speaking up is a whole neighborhood doing it together. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. I read every single one. By the end of the week, it was clear Brenda had reached her breaking point, and naturally, she responded with the suburban version of a counter-strike, a community-wide live stream. The email invite arrived with the subject line, "Preserving Birch Hollow's Integrity in Times of Crisis," which is HOA language for "Everyone gather around, I'm about to lie with PowerPoint." The broadcast was scheduled for 7 p.m. sharp, and by then, half the neighborhood was either logged in or hovering behind a spouse who was. Brenda appeared framed in perfect lighting, wrapped in a blazer that probably cost more than the soil tests we were about to need, and wearing a face that said, I've got everything under control. But her eyes? They flickered like someone who smelled smoke and couldn't find the fire alarm. She started with a calm voice and a script that dripped with artificial empathy. I know many of you have been disturbed by recent events involving our beloved Lake Birch. That's how you know the gaslighting's about to begin, when they start calling things beloved. Brenda blamed the lake's condition on unauthorized interference by individuals with personal grievances and casually accused someone, she never used my name, of creating an unnecessary panic through misinformation. Her speech was a power suit stitched from delusion, the kind of polished monologue that sounds impressive until you realize it doesn't answer a single question. And then, slowly, the comments started rolling in. Jasmine was first. What do you call unauthorized interference when the water smells like paint thinner and fish are dying? Then Frank chimed in. Still waiting on an answer about the 1988 dam inspection. When was the last real one? I dropped in a link to the county maintenance records, missing decades of data. That's when the chat started turning. What began as a lecture became a Q&A. Brenda couldn't control. But the moment that flipped the whole script was when Mrs. Delaney posted, "My husband said this lake smelled like bleach in 2009. He filed a complaint and got fined for defamation. Who's spreading fear now?" For a second, the video lagged like the internet itself was stunned. The rest of the stream was downhill from there. Brenda tried to pivot back to her slides, charts about lake health, bar graphs with no labels, quotes from independent consultants who sounded suspiciously like her cousin Earl, but the damage was done. It was no longer a live stream, it was a mutiny. Neighbors started sharing photos in the chat, murky water, dead fish, even a screenshot of her previous email blaming seasonal drainage. The HOA's credibility wasn't just cracking, it was crumbling like bad stucco in a rainstorm. The live stream was less TED Talk, more DEFCON 2. You could almost see her blinking Morse code for help. But the real punch came the next morning. 2 county environmental engineers pulled up in a truck with a hazmat logo on the side. They were dressed in full gear, carrying metal cases and serious expressions. One of them asked if I could point them to the spillway and testing sites. I didn't even need to answer. Half the neighborhood had already gathered, silently watching them walk toward the lake like the truth had finally shown up with a badge. And Brenda? She was nowhere in sight. For a woman who loved public announcements, she sure knew how to vanish when the audience turned. That night, as the buzz around the live stream shifted from disbelief to realization, I sat on my porch thinking about everything we'd just witnessed. Brenda had tried to control the story with charm and bullet points, but she forgot the first rule of HOA rulebooks. When too many people start comparing fines, they start comparing facts. And once the facts are public, perception doesn't belong to the loudest. It belongs to the most truthful. And trust me, when the truth leaks out of a lake, it doesn't just trickle, it floods. There's a moment in every storm when you stop checking the radar and just brace. That's what it felt like the morning I opened the spillway for real. Not a nudge, not a trickle, but a full throttle release. No more metaphors, no more signs in the dirt. It was time for the lake to speak, loud and ugly. The crank squealed like it hadn't moved since disco was in style, and the gate dropped with the slow, sick sound of consequences coming due. Within minutes, the water started dropping like a bad stock tip, and by the next sunrise, Lake Birch looked less like a postcard and more like a cautionary tale written in mud. The lake bed didn't lie. As the water peeled back, it revealed everything Brenda had been painting over for years. Sludge, thick enough to trap your boots. Rusted metal barrels poking through the muck like bones from a shallow grave. And a rainbow sheen on the surface that shimmered like oil trying to look festive. The lake bed looked like a landfill wearing a Sunday hat. Neighbors gathered in clusters, staring in stunned silence. You could hear them processing what they were seeing. Quiet gasps, nervous laughter, that sharp inhale people make when they realize the HOA newsletter forgot to mention the buried toxic waste. By noon, the news vans started rolling in. First the local station, then 2 regional affiliates, and finally some national crew with drone cameras and fancy microphones. I stood on my porch drinking black coffee and watching reporters set up live shots on what used to be my peaceful shoreline. Brenda finally appeared, barefoot on her back deck, mascara smudged, hair clinging to her face in frizzed panic. She looked like a soap opera villain right after the affair goes public. A cameraman caught her trying to wave them off, shouting something about property rights and media trespassing, but no one listened. It's hard to pull rank when you're standing next to a lake bed that smells like chemical warfare. Then came the confirmation, straight from the EPA's on-site team who showed up in full hazmat suits like we'd called in an alien landing. They ran tests, took soil samples, and left nothing to interpretation. The contamination was 10 times the federal safety limit. Lead, solvents, heavy metals, enough environmental sins to bankrupt a small country. Truth has a smell. It's petroleum and panic. The press conference was short and grim. This site will be designated for emergency remediation, they said. The health risks are ongoing and significant. You could feel the collective stomach drop across Birch Hollow, like someone just announced their retirement fund had vanished. That evening, as the last rays of sunlight hit the oily ridges of the drained lake, neighbors stood shoulder to shoulder, stunned. People who hadn't spoken in years were suddenly leaning on each other, swapping stories, connecting dots. I overheard one man say, "My dog got sick 3 years ago after swimming in that water." A woman added, "Our basement always smelled weird. We thought it was mold." And that's when I realized the real flood wasn't just water, it was memory. It was finally admitting the signs had always been there. We'd just chosen the view over the truth. The water had been our mirror, now it was our reckoning. Brenda always carried herself like the queen of Birch Hollow, coiffed, calculated, and convinced the HOA board was her personal court. But queens forget something crucial. When the moat drains, the throne's just a lawn chair on stilts. The Monday after the EPA announcement, the neighborhood was buzzing louder than a chainsaw at sunrise. News trucks were still parked on the curb, drones hovered like lazy hawks, and Brenda had gone radio silent. No emails, no fines, not even one of her friendly reminders. It was like she'd vanished into the mulch. I figured she was hiding, drafting a legal defense with whatever attorney could still return her calls. Turns out, she had a different plan, and it involved a sledgehammer. It happened at dusk. Frank was walking his dog Earl near the spillway when he spotted movement by the maintenance shed. A shadow in heels and panic. Brenda was hunched over the spillway controls, swinging like she was trying to beat a confession out of the metal. She was muttering about reversing the flow, Frank told me later, like she could refill the lake and erase the past in one swoop. Her plan, if you can call it that, was to smash the mechanism, cause enough damage to flood the basin and make the contamination vanish under a few shiny feet of water. Never mind the risk to the downstream neighborhoods or the small issue of, federal crimes. She went from queen to court jester in one leak. Frank called 911. The police came fast, probably because even they were tired of her. They found Brenda wild-eyed, mascara running, waving the hammer like it was a microphone. She screamed something about taking back control and media sabotage before they cuffed her next to the mud-spattered gate. By the time the feds got involved, it was no longer a local spectacle. It was a case file. She was charged with attempted environmental sabotage, obstruction of a federal investigation, and conspiracy to defraud the community. And just like that, the clipboard tyrant of Birch Hollow was dethroned, zip-tied, and escorted into the back of a squad car while Earl barked once. Like applause? And the fallout was immediate. Residents who once nodded politely at HOA meetings now organized under folding tents with clipboards of their own, this time for cleanup plans and class action paperwork. Clara stepped up in a way that surprised no one. Turns out, she'd been collecting documents for years, old meeting notes, anonymous letters, flagged invoices. She didn't raise her voice, she raised awareness. Frank, meanwhile, became the neighborhood's de facto project manager, coordinating inspections, securing contractor bids, and fixing everything Brenda had tried to duct tape with policy. They weren't leaders because they wanted power. They became leaders because the rest of us finally realized we needed truth more than tulips. Brenda, for her part, disappeared. Rumor had it she was holed up in her sister's condo in Clearwater, awaiting trial while avoiding headlines. Her mansion sat empty, a $5 million monument to the hazards of unchecked authority. The shutters drooped, the lawn browned. No one dared touch it. Kids started calling it the haunted house, which felt about right. Every brick whispered a lie someone was forced to live with. You can't build empires on swamp lies. Not when the whole neighborhood's standing knee-deep in the muck you tried to hide. We were a mess, financially, structurally, emotionally, but there was this strange new feeling floating around Birch Hollow. It wasn't relief, not yet, but it was possibility. Like someone had kicked open a door that we didn't realize had been locked for years. We weren't just recovering from contamination, we were unlearning silence. And standing at the edge of a drained lake that had once been our pride and joy, I realized something else. You don't just rebuild because things broke. You rebuild because it's the only way to prove they were never stronger than the people they tried to drown. 6 months after the water drained, the lake bed looked less like a disaster and more like a blueprint. The EPA trucks had come and gone, the hazmat suits replaced by engineers in hard hats, and Birch Hollow, formerly known for matching shutters and militant tulips, was learning how to build again. And me? I built a new bridge. Not as long as the first, not as polished, but stronger in all the ways that matter. This one didn't curve or show off. It connected. It grounded. It reminded people what could grow in the middle of a mess. Funny how wood and nails can do what policy and fines never could. Bring people together. Neighbors started asking for help. First it was Clara. She wanted a ramp for her backyard dock, said she trusted me more than any contractor with a logo. Then Frank wanted to build a seating platform where his kids used to fish. Then Jasmine asked if I could help design something simple for her son to launch his kayak. I became the unofficial dock guy of Birch Hollow. But we weren't just fixing wood. We were fixing what Brenda had broken. Trust, agency, the idea that community wasn't a weapon. I'd see folks who used to hide behind HOA rules show up with coffee and hammers. People started waving again, not just out of politeness, but like they actually meant it. One evening, while sanding down a railing, I opened the mailbox and found a thick envelope with no return address. Inside was a letter from a man in another state. Different HOA, different lake, same story. He'd seen our story in the news and wanted advice. Said their board was silencing residents, covering up environmental tests, issuing fines for the sake of fear. Your fight gave us hope, he wrote. Would you be willing to share how you exposed the truth? I stared at the paper for a long time, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I finally understood what had really been built here. This wasn't about lakefront property anymore. This was about showing people they weren't crazy and they weren't alone. Some nights, I still sit on that bridge, the new one, the real one. I watch the sun bounce off the construction cranes in the distance and the slow work of honest progress, and I think about what it means to rebuild. This time the bridge wasn't to the lake. It was to a future where no one lies about the mud, where silence isn't a requirement for belonging, where clipboard queens don't get to decide who deserves peace. Brenda destroyed my first bridge, thinking she was tearing down rebellion, but all she did was give me reason to build something that couldn't be fined, flagged, or paved over. Some bridges are worth rebuilding, no matter who tears them down. You know, when Brenda ripped down that first bridge, I thought she was taking something from me. And for a while, I believed it. Believed I'd lost more than wood. But now, I realize she gave me something I never expected. Clarity. Not just about the lake, or the HOA, or the dam, but about what we settle for when we're afraid to speak up. That bridge was never just about crossing water. It was about reclaiming something deeper, dignity, truth. The right to call something home and not have to beg permission to protect it. And here's what I hope folks take from all this. Rules aren't the problem, but the people who hide behind them, the ones who weaponize procedure to silence truth. They count on our silence. They count on us being too tired, too polite, too isolated to resist. But when we stop letting fear sit at the head of the table, the entire neighborhood starts to breathe again. We didn't just drain a lake. We drained, and in its place we found something worth rebuilding. Not perfect lawns or curated views, but real community. Honest, muddy, imperfect community. So if you felt something during this story, if you recognized your HOA or your neighbor, or even your own hesitation, share this video with someone who needs it. Maybe they've been fined into silence. Maybe they're still waiting for someone else to go first. Let them know they're not alone. Leave a comment below and tell me what hit hardest. Like and subscribe if you want more stories that peel back the curtain and put power in the hands of the people. Because this is how we build the next bridge. Together.